In art, genius and suffering have often gone hand in hand. But for Peter Paul Rubens, professional achievement was combined with lifelong personal happiness. By the end of his life in 1640, he was a man of great wealth, known and respected across Europe. He was an artist of the highest rank, a prodigious painter whose influence has spanned the centuries. It is Rubens' huge body of work that makes him possibly the greatest of all the Dutch and Flemish masters.
Rubens, I think, is a unique figure at the time. There's nobody really to rival Rubens in the 17th century. Even in Italy, there are people that can't compete with this vibrant energy and life that he manages to put into paintings.
You look at Rubens' paintings, you think of theatre, you think of the presentation within a theatrical context, within a proscenium arch of a particular scene. And you have also a sense that the figures move about within, there's a real sense of three-dimension within Rubens' canvases, the way that he places his figures with clear space between them. A sense of real drama. He's a great storyteller.
Rubens wanted to produce a world that was like a parallel universe, quite obviously artificial, but it was like an enhanced nature. It was a more sort of glittering, especially in his later work, where I think he's actually influenced by Van Dyck, but a sort of gilded nature. And light and colour were central.
The life of Peter Paul Rubens coincided with a period of ongoing political and religious turmoil in the Netherlands. By 1579, there existed a clear distinction between Protestant Holland to the north and Catholic Flanders to the south. One man who reflected the turmoil of the times was a wealthy citizen of Flemish Antwerp, Jan Rubens. Jan Rubens was exiled to the town of Siegen. There, shortly after, his loyal wife Maria gave birth to a son, Philip. A second son followed on June 28, 1577. He was christened Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens was raised as a Catholic, and his devotion to the Roman Church would remain with him throughout his life.
He believed in the authority of the Church, the authority of God, believed in the saints, and he believed in the four last things. That's life, death, judgment, and heaven and hell. His religious beliefs had an enormous effect on both his life and his work. He lived a moderate and respectable life. In his paintings, he's trying to put over the Catholic Orthodox view of religion, and his paintings were meant to be seen as aids to prayer and also meditation.
He was deeply faithful to the Catholic Church, and painting and image making as being absolutely central to the way in which you worship God, you move towards God. The image provides a kind of stairway or a doorway between earth and heaven in the Catholic faith. One might really say that Rubens would not have become a painter, I think, had he not been a Catholic.
By the end of the 1590s, the young Rubens' professional destiny was also clear. At the age of 11, he attended Verdonk School near Antwerp's Gothic Cathedral, where he began a lifelong love affair with classical literature. But his real passion was painting. Still in his early teens, he was apprenticed to a local landscape artist, Tobias Verheek. He then spent 4 years with the portraitist Adam van Noort before moving on in 1596 to work in the studio of Antwerp's best-known painter, Otto van Veen. It was Van Veen who introduced Rubens to engravings of great Italian Renaissance paintings. And in 2 of the earliest surviving works by Rubens, we can clearly identify this influence. Adam and Eve in Paradise and Judgment of Paris were both inspired by the work of the great Raphael, as copied by the engraver Marcantonio Raimondi. By this time, Rubens was established as a painter in his own right, but he knew he had to experience the Italian masters directly. So in May 1600, at the age of 22, he left Antwerp and headed south. 2 months later, he arrived at his Italian destination, Venice.
What Rubens does is to open himself up to every type of art that he saw in Italy. So he's interested in the antique, he's interested in the High Renaissance, he's interested in contemporary artists like Caravaggio and the Carracci. He studied Titian carefully, he went to Villa Farnese and saw the great collection of Titians there.
It's an absolute revelation to him seeing Titian in all its glorious colour. We know that he copied paintings, and we know too that Rubens was particularly taken by Titian's Great Assumption in the Frari Church in Venice.
Not long after arriving in Italy, Rubens secured a position as court painter to the Duke of Mantua. But as a young man, his passion was to fully learn his art. To do this, he needed to travel to the greatest center of Italian artistic achievement, the city of Rome. Rubens was thrilled when, in June 1601, he arrived in Rome for the first time. Here he spent a great deal of time drawing classical sculpture in particular.
Rome represented classical culture, the centre of Catholicism, and it represented the High Renaissance, the source of artistic prestige, and it represented fashionable art too, new innovation, originality, the idea of the artist as somebody who makes progress.
When Rubens is in Rome, he comes into contact with the two greatest living artists. That's Annibale Carracci and Caravaggio. Carracci was seen as the person that had regenerated Italian art. After the excesses and artificialities of mannerism, Annibale Carracci put art back onto a real and naturalistic footing. His great work is the Farnese ceiling. It was seen as one of the great wonders of modern art. And by looking at Carracci, Rubens realised how to compose groups harmoniously, but also to give them coherence and clarity. Caravaggio, of course, was one of the artists who gave new readings of biblical subjects. He gave them dynamism, he gave them interest as well. And it's from Caravaggio that Rubens learns about lighting and also about how animating groups and making spectators become involved in the subject.
Rubens' first visit to Rome lasted some 8 months. By the time he left for Mantua, he had completed 3 large paintings for the Church of St. Helena, the first of the artist's many commissions for religious work. But in early 1603, the Duke of Mantua presented Rubens with a very different kind of task: to travel to Spain to present gifts to King Philip III. At the time, this was the kind of gesture often made by small states trying to keep in favor with the great powers.
Artists had been diplomats for a very long time because they often went to foreign courts to take gifts to foreign courts or to paint portraits of members of foreign courts, particularly family members. The sovereign would want them to be relied upon to make an authentic likeness. A good example of that is Henry VIII sending Holbein to make a portrait of a prospective wife for himself. I think what's different about Rubens is the level of diplomatic activity that he was engaged in.
Well, he was very intelligent and very well educated. He was also a shrewd judge of character, and I think very importantly for a diplomat, he knew when to keep his mouth shut. Everybody says that he was very charming, although he didn't crack many jokes, I don't think. Rubens was also a great linguist. His native language was Flemish, but he could also speak Spanish, French, Latin, which was spoken amongst scholars at that time, and his favourite language of all was Italian. Now, Italian was the diplomatic language, so that's obviously very useful to have, and he always signed himself in Italian. He signed himself Pietro Paolo Rubens.
Amongst the gifts for the Spanish king were a number of paintings, copies of great works by Titian and Raphael. This is the Duke of Lerma, the strongest figure in the Spanish court, nobly depicted on his white stallion. It was a canvas which impressed its subject, and Rubens' Spanish expedition widened his already extensive network of contacts. Rubens returned to Mantua in early 1604. He was commissioned to paint 3 works for the city's Jesuit church, with the altarpiece including depictions of his employer and his family, a typical feature of religious commissions of the time. Back in Rome the following year, He created this altarpiece for the new church of the Oratorian priests. This second Roman stay was a happy time for Rubens, living with his brother Philip, enjoying the artistic and intellectual life of the city. Philosophy was one of the many subjects that interested him, and it is clear that the classical school of Stoic philosophy held a particular appeal for him.
His philosophical beliefs are about modesty, about virtue, and about constancy. They're linked with an important philosophical movement both in Italy, throughout Europe really, in the later 16th century and earlier 17th century, which is called Neo-Stoicism. It particularly means maintaining a kind of steadfastness in the face of adversity. Say, for example, in relation to the death of his wife Isabella Brandt, he's certainly calling upon Neo-Stoic principles there.
Rubens left Rome in July 1607 and traveled to the wealthy city of Genoa with his employer. Unsurprisingly, he painted many wealthy Genovese citizens during his visit, including this canvas depicting Giovanni Carlo Doria. By 1608, Rubens was again in Rome, completing the new church altarpiece. But on 27 October that year, he received a grave communication from his home city. His mother was seriously ill. By the time he arrived in Antwerp, his mother had already been buried. Rubens now had to decide whether to stay in Flanders or to return south. His mind was made up by a generous offer from the Catholic regents of the Netherlands, Archduke Albert and Infanta Isabella. On a salary of 500 florins a year, he became their court painter. Peter Paul Rubens was back in Antwerp. There were also strong personal reasons for Rubens to return. His brother Philip was now secretary of the city. When Philip married early in 1609, Rubens cheerfully doubted if he could ever match his brother's choice of bride. But in October he did, when he married 19-year-old Isabella Brandt.
Rubens is 32 when he gets married. Like so many other professionals of his time, he waits until he's established himself before he gets married. The honeysuckle bower portrait, I think, is all about trust and fidelity. He arranges it by a lot of interlocking shapes, so there's this sense that the two depend on one another. The honeysuckle was an emblem of love, and by clasping hands, they suggest fidelity as well.
The way that they sit together, the way that their hands are entwined, I mean, the relationship, this loving relationship between husband and wife, this is very, very intensely touching, it seems to me. It's painted this wonderful early linear style, this rather sculptural style of the early Rubens. The colour is beautiful, the colours of the clothes they both wear. And then, of course, the symbolism of the tree, which is wrapped around with ivy, which, of course, is a famous symbol at the time of marital fidelity.
Now married, Rubens began to settle for the first time in his life. These portraits of Archduke Albert and the Infanta Isabella represent his first commissions for his new employers. Once again, he succeeded in capturing the dignity of nobility, but without neglecting individual personality, in these striking images with their vivid red sunset background. For Flemish painters of religious images, the second decade of the 1600s was an often profitable time. Major works were commissioned for many of Antwerp's churches, with Rubens the recipient of many of these commissions.
What I think is Baroque about Rubens's work is the sense of theatricality and drama. The paintings are meant to address a spectator and address the spectator as somebody possessing all their senses. And a good example of that might be the raising of the cross, which is a picture that's often compared with the descent from the cross. It also is displayed, a wonderful display now in Antwerp Cathedral, each on either side of the aisle. You can see on the bottom left-hand side a dog coming to lick the blood, Christ's blood. So the sense of taste is being evoked there. The sense of sight, or indeed spiritual blindness, is evoked by a terrifying, I think, bald, huge, muscly executioner who is pushing Christ's body up and pressing his face against his side so close to him that he can't see. So he's blind in the sense that he can't see that what he's raising to the sky is the saviour of mankind.
Rubens at his most poignant is in the Descent from the Cross. Now it's painted for the Guild of Arquebusiers in Antwerp Cathedral, and their patron saint was St Christopher. But St Christopher doesn't appear in the painting, he appears on one of the back panels. But the whole painting is about the visualisation, a meditation, if you like, on the meaning of the word Christopher, which means Christ bearer. So we see many aspects of Christ being born, being carried by people in the painting. So as he's coming down from the cross, he's supported by St John the Evangelist and Mary Magdalene. If you look in the bottom right of the painting, there's a bowl of blood, looks very much like altar wine. So the faithful, when they take communion, partake of Christ's body, and they also support him within them.
Rubens painted enduring religious images throughout the 1610s. But these were not the only commissions Rubens received at the time. He also painted many mythological scenes, such as Ganymede and the Eagle.
The change in Rubens' style in the second half of the 1610s, I think, can be related to the issue of the use of canvas rather than panel, his ability to persuade people to use canvas, his ability to say, I am going to do it the way that I want to do it rather than the traditional way that you want to do it. In the early parts of the 1610s, he tends to use quite large areas of solid colour. Say you have got an area of red drapery, such as the fantastic area of red drapery in St John the Evangelist in the Descent from the Cross. It's all red, and it's all basically the same carmine red with glazes above it to create shadow. In the later part of the 1610s, he starts to produce a kind of tapestry almost. There's a kind of sheen on the painting, and local colour becomes less important, so that you might have purples or blues in a red area. It's not all red, and it produces this shimmering effect of surface where the paint seems to float on the surface of the painting, so the outlines of the forms become less distinct and they seem to meld one into another, and you get more of a sense of the brush stroke itself. It's not that you can see the individual brush stroke, but there's a kind of sense of planes and areas of painting that refer to the action of the artist's hand.
The greatest example of the secular Baroque, if you like, the non-religious Baroque, is Rubens' Lion Hunt. So we've got this terrific, almost explosion of energy taking place in the painting. Right in the centre of the painting, the lion is sinking its teeth into a horse. We've also got these great diagonals that again add to the movement and instability in the painting. And we're also not sure who's going to win this battle. Even if the lions are going to be killed, they're giving a pretty good account of themselves.
Rubens' huge output would have been beyond the abilities of any man to achieve completely single-handed. Instead, he was the head of a large studio, a classically influenced building across the courtyard from his home. Some artists were employed to carry out the most mundane tasks, such as grinding the paint. Others, such as the young Anthony van Dyck, were given more responsibility. In this 1612 canvas depicting Prometheus, the eagle is the work of his associate Franz Snyders. Finally, there were works entirely by the great master himself.
I like to think of Rubens as either like a film director, so that he's the orchestrator of lots and lots of other people working, or the kind of director of a factory, so to think about him as Rubens Limited. Imagine that you've got a brand name called Rubens, and you've got to stamp that brand name on works that look like Rubens, so that it's a particular style or mode of representation or mode of painting, a style of painting that is recognisably Rubens, but not necessarily all by Rubens's hand. He wants to produce as much as possible because the demand for his work is huge, and he's chosen very, very carefully an environment where he's bound to do well, because there's been so much destruction of painting and other kinds of images through the iconoclasm that there's a kind of gap in the market.
In the early 1620s, Rubens completed, on time, no less than 39 ceiling paintings for Antwerp's new Jesuit church. Sadly, they were destroyed by fire in 1718, but many of the preliminary works survive. Preparatory panels, or modelli such as this, give us an insight into how Rubens went about creating his finest works.
Very often he would just start with a few drawings, but what he always did, sometimes right at the beginning, sometimes after the drawings, was to produce a colour sketch. So right from the beginning he's thinking in terms of light and colour. Once he'd established the general lines of a composition, he could pass them on to his studio. They understood what he wanted. They would do a lot of the work. He would then have the final say and retouch anything that required retouching.
Shortly after Rubens had successfully completed the ceiling paintings for the Jesuit church, the European political situation began to change. For the next 9 or so years, much of Rubens' time was taken up with diplomacy. Towards the end of the decade, he was effectively a full-time diplomat, involved in desperately complex negotiations.
Rubens' diplomatic career was as a representative of the Archduchess Isabella. He had, of course, been court painter to Albert and Isabella, but after Albert's death in 1621, he becomes very close to the Archduchess, and he acts as a political representative, and he travels to Spain, particularly, and to England. This is the first stage. In those 17th century diplomatic negotiations, you had to agree to an exchange of ambassadors. And what Rubens does in that visit is set up an exchange of ambassadors.
Rubens' diplomatic efforts would ultimately prove successful, but we know he grew frustrated at the sheer amount of his time that was consumed. In January 1622, he was summoned to Paris by Maria de' Medici, the widow of Henry IV and mother of the young King Louis XIII. She commissioned a series of 24 paintings depicting events from her own life to be installed in the new Luxembourg Palace.
The cycle was to be about the great deeds of Marie de' Medici. The problem was there weren't that many. So Rubens has the problem of magnifying very minor episodes in her life into great historical events. If we look at the education of Marie de' Medici, she's shown next to the goddess Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. Next to her we've got Apollo playing his lyre, and swooping down at the top we've got Mercury with his caduceus, so eloquence and reason as well. So again, all of these allegorical personifications are meant to convince us that this was something out of the ordinary. The event of Marie de' Medici arriving in France for the first time, arriving at Marseille, is also amplified into a great event by Rubens. She's shown stepping off the royal ship. She's greeted by a personification of France and also a personification of Marseille. You can tell this is a city because this woman has little castles in her hair. And at the bottom you've got Neptune writhing around with sea nymphs greeting her. And right at the top of the painting, Fame flies across with a trumpet announcing the arrival of this great woman.
Remarkably, Rubens was able to turn his attention to other works, even as he worked at the Medici cycle. This delightful double portrait of his 2 sons, Albert and Nicholas, is an undeniably affectionate depiction, a study in boyhood, especially emphasized by the illumination of the older son, Albert. For an artist inspired by Titian, Rubens' mastery of light is unsurprising and can also be seen in this portrait of Susanna Formant, a depiction of a friend's wife from the early 1620s. In June 1626, his wife Isabella died. His only daughter Clara had already died 3 years before. By March of that year, the efforts of Rubens the diplomat had succeeded in brokering a peace between England and Spain, resulting in a knighthood for the painter from the English king Charles I. A similar honor was bestowed on him by the Spanish king a year later, an unparalleled honor for a painter. He was also now an extremely wealthy man, having sold the majority of his antique collection to the English nobleman, the Duke of Buckingham, here drawn by Rubens himself.
The 1630s marks a late phase in Rubens's life. He died in 1640, characterised by what I would regard as the freedom to do whatever he likes. He returns to Antwerp after quite a long period abroad in England and Spain, and also having been in France, and he buys a country residence. For him, this had classical precedence. It was like Roman senators buying their country villas and retreating to country villas, away from the hurly-burly and demands of court life, of diplomatic service, and of the commercial pressures.
Back in Antwerp, Rubens understandably sought to put his political life behind him and return full-time to his art. He married Helena Formont, sister of Susanna, the young woman he had painted some years before. Rubens was now 53 years of age. His new bride was 16. In 10 years of marriage, 5 children resulted, the last conceived just 1 month before the artist's death. Predictably, the early 1630s saw Rubens engaged in more ambitious projects, notably the ceiling decoration for the banqueting house in London's Whitehall.
In the 1630s, Rubens, as we know, was tremendously successful. He no longer needed commissions, so he was looking to paint much more for himself and also to spend more time with his family. And in 1633, he buys the chateau and estate of Steen, which is south of Antwerp, near the town of Malines. He paints the chateau of Steen in the great landscape that's in the National Gallery in London. It's a great panoramic landscape. We see undulating hills. There's a bit of artistic license there because, as we know, the area is very flat.
They relate to past worlds, perfect worlds, worlds of peace and beauty or romantic deeds, rather than the toil and labour of landscape. In the very way they're constructed, to me, they seem to express his freedom to indulge his artistic ambitions, because quite a number of them, it's been noticed, start quite small, with a small panel maybe this big, and he gradually adds panels to each side, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, so that eventually they're a very large scale landscapes relating to the seasons, maybe 6 feet across or even perhaps more, such as the famous landscape called Het Steen in the National Gallery, and its companion piece, the Rainbow Landscape, in the Wallace collection.
In my view, these pictures were painted as a decorative scheme for one of the principal rooms in the Chateau de Steen. In a way, Rubens could sit in this room in his house and look, as it were, into the pictures, into the landscape that was around him. He really has a very organic and profound view of landscape. He's much more powerful, as you'd expect, in his landscape painting than the landscape specialists.
Sadly, the creator of these timeless scenes was increasingly stricken by attacks of gout, and the end of Rubens' remarkable life was drawing near. It was possibly as late as 1640 that he chose to paint one of the few self-portraits of his career. On May 30, 1640, Peter Paul Rubens died. There have been few, if any, artists who have achieved so much in both working and personal lives. Perhaps only Rembrandt can rival Rubens for the title Greatest of the Dutch Masters.